So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we think about making products that people love to use. Sort of our slogan at Massive is less about, at the moment, changing people's behavior, because that's really hard. Instead, you need this sort of surrogate goal to get there. And so the phrase that we constantly come back to is making products about people's health that they love to use. Because if you can't make people smile, and if you can't make people want to use your thing, they're certainly not going to change your behavior. So you have to get step A to step B. So you can send me feedback at Aza on Twitter. I'll try really hard not to look at it during the talk. So the first thing to realize as you're trying to make products for people is that it's not your fault. Or in general, it's not their fault. The very best way to do user research is incredibly painful. What you do is you take your developers, and you take you, and you sit yourselves down in front of a user, and then you put duct tape over your mouth, and then you watch them use it. And it's an incredibly frustrating experience because they're going to use it the wrong way. But of course, that's the way people actually use it. So you have to design for that. So an example. How many of you remember what a VCR is? Yeah? This is probably the last audience I can ever use this analogy with. Right, but so if you can't program a VCR, whose fault is that? Is it your fault? Or is it the fault of the guy that designed it? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's the fault of the guy that designed it, right? So that's interesting because let's go take a look at another example of this. Let's take a look at it in antibiotics. We know that 22% of Americans and Canadians, generally people in the Western world, never finish their antibiotics course. It's almost, that's a little bit more than 1 out of 5. And no amount of public service announcements and education has really changed that number. And we know that it creates super viruses. We know it does all sorts of terrible things, but people start feeling fine. Therefore, they think that they're fine. So here's the question. Is it people's fault that they just can't get it through their heads to finish their antibiotics course? Or is it the fault of the design of our intervention? I think it's pretty obvious that it's the fault of the design of our intervention, that we, as a medical community, don't make products that work the way people do. And I'll come back to some of the potential solutions that follow along Enrique's more emotional design. But same thing in diabetes. People know that they should test their blood glucose levels. And people who don't actually prick often say, like, oh, it must be painful, and that's the reason why they don't. But no, the real reason is that they prick. One, it's hard to remember, and then two, you get out a number. Is part of sort of creating user empathy. Everyone at Massive Health pricks our fingers and takes our blood glucose levels. And I remember there was this one time that I just played basketball, and I took my blood glucose levels, and it was 180. You're like, well, one, what the hell does that mean? And two, looked it up, and that's really, really high. And I'd never had a number above, say, like 95. And so I looked it up, and Yahoo Answers definitively told me that I was pregnant, which I thought was pretty cool. That was like, I don't know, 6 months ago, so I'll let you know how it goes in those at 3. But that's the level of support, right? If this is the thing that determines whether a person lives or dies, this number, and the best support we give people is just an integer, that's not designed for people, that's designed for a database. So, obesity. This is probably not news to any of you. This is obesity numbers in the UK. So you can see 1995, this is true obesity was around 16.4%. By 2020 and 25 it goes up. And then by 2020, it's projected by Cambridge to be up at 43%. Obesity, which is ridiculous. And then you realize if it's not just obesity, and you're just looking at being overweight, the number actually is a little bit bigger than that. That number sort of rises and rises so that 8 out of 10 people will be overweight in the UK 2020, which sort of indicates to you that you probably shouldn't eat breakfast over there. This is scary. So here's the question, though. Is it the fault of the people, or is it the fault of the way we make products to help people cope with the sort of the calorie glut that surrounds us? I think the answer should again be obvious, and it is the fault of our institutions or methodologies for helping people cope with these conditions that are at fault. And so it's our moral obligation to create fantastic consumer products that help people. So, insanity. What's its definition? It's repeating the same mistakes and expecting different results. I'm always amused by this quote because it's often associated, or it's often attributed to Einstein, or sometimes to Twain, and sometimes to Franklin. But in fact, it was coined in 1983 by a woman named Rita Mae Brown in her book, Sudden Death. I find that truly ironic because a quote about repeating mistakes is often repeated in terms of mistakes. But whatever we're doing with our healthcare system now does not work. Another way to say that is that our healthcare system is clinically insane. So, set up the problem, how do we go about solving it? Well, for me, as I started Massive, there's one thing that was sort of deep in my mind, and that is my entire family is overweight, and if I'm truly honest, obese. And I wanted to understand why, at a very fundamental level. My mother in particular is overweight, and so I wanted to just get this understanding of why is she so overweight. I have a star up there, by the way, and that star is to remind me to tell you that this is not a picture of my mother. So why? Why is she overweight? Well, is it because she's clueless? Does she just not know? That, by the way, is a turkey, but I don't know what he's holding. So is she clueless? No, she's a nurse practitioner. She helped start the palliative care unit here at CPMC. She's a published nurse practitioner, so she's not clueless. She's not dumb. She has to see the truly negative ramifications of being overweight at end-of-life care, right? She has, more than almost any one of us, a visceral understanding. So it's not education that's doing it. So why is she overweight? Well, for this, I think we have to step back. This is what we always do in design. Design is not about thinking outside the box, but about finding a box to think inside of. And so we have to figure out what that box is. What is the problem? And the problem here, I think, comes from just basic cognitive psychology, basic behavioral economics, and that can be summed up in two things. We all have problems as humans with delayed gratification and time discounting. Delayed gratification is simply valuing the pleasure you get now differently than the value of the pleasure you get in the future. And generally, you'd rather eat that piece of chocolate right now than you would 5 minutes from now. And time discounting is the same thing. It's just valuing your time now differently than you value your time in the future. So let me give you some examples of this. How many of you know about the marshmallow experiment? Ooh, excellent. That's a lot of you. But you're still not immune to awesome videos of kids. So the marshmallow experiment, for the people that don't know, is particularly interesting. The IQ test was originally developed to predict whether kids will be successful later on in life. It doesn't do a very good job of doing that prediction. If you're above a certain threshold and that threshold is not very high, it has no predictive value. They can't tell whether you do better or worse. The marshmallow test has fantastic ability to predict whether kids will be successful later on in life. And all the marshmallow test is childhood torture. I mean, all it is you give a kid a marshmallow and you say, I'm going to leave the room for 15 minutes. If you've eaten that marshmallow, fine. But if you haven't eaten that marshmallow, I'm going to give you another marshmallow. And to kids, this is awesome. And then you wait and you see what happens. So these are these kids' coping mechanisms as they try desperately to wait out those 15 minutes to get that other marshmallow. So it turns out that the kids that don't eat the marshmallow, that have delayed gratification, can put it off, they are almost universally successful later on in life. For whatever metric you care to define, whether it's income or house ownership or things like that. And the kids that don't, it's around a 2/3, 1/3 split. It's a much harder to determine whether they do well in life. 2/3 of them don't do very well. So that's interesting. And you can administer this when you're like 5, 6, 7. So any of you that have kids, now you know what to do you're doing tonight. My favorite, by the way, was there's this one girl who thought she was being really clever, and she had a marshmallow, and she hollowed out the inside, and she put it back down. I was like, look, I didn't eat it. And I'm pretty sure she's a politician now. So, all right, so that's delayed gratification. But then there's also time discounting. But I should stop and say, when I'm designing products, and when my team design products, we often use this as a design koan, a little question. If you were trying to change people's behavior, can your product also change people's behavior for these kids? What would enable these kids to overcome eating that marshmallow? Is it a distraction, like a game that they play on the sidewise? Is it a number of points that they get for every 10 seconds they don't eat that marshmallow? Maybe it's just a video feed of other kids trying hard not to eat the marshmallow, and now it's a little bit of a competition. So we use this as a way of thinking through and making simpler design for behavior change. So time discounting. I'm sure because we're in the US, you've all seen these sort of mail-in rebates. Turns out that they're illegal in the UK. Which made this talk more interesting when I gave it over there. So they're like, what are you talking about? But mail-in rebates, right? You get $10 back, so it's clearly, if it was a $30 product, it's really just a $20 product. But the rates of sending these things in are abysmal. I think it's less than 5% that actually get sent in. So that's crazy, right? Because you know that this is $10. And if in fact the thing was $30, you probably wouldn't have bought it in the first place. So this is a great way of a company taking advantage of the fact that the $10 you're saving now is different than the $10 that you could save in the future. Another example of this is New Year's resolutions. How many of you made New Year's resolutions this year? How many of you have already broken them? Yeah, I thought so. Right, because this is sort of this expectation that your time now is different than the time in the future. So while I'm not going to exercise right now, I know that I'll be exercising in the future. I know I'm going to eat better in the future, and that's always just next week. And so at the beginning of the year, you think that by the end of the year, you're definitely going to look like this. But in reality, you end up looking like this. This is a real picture, by the way. So I'll give you the one secret to behavior change, and what I think is as well the secret to creating really compelling user experiences, and that is this circle, feedback, and giving people feedback. We are fundamentally learning machines. That's what our brain does. We take patterns and we learn them. And one of the reasons why you get so many crazy fad diets about being healthy is because it's really hard. You eat something and you don't know for weeks and weeks whether it's actually having an effect on your body. There's this disconnect between your brain and what your body does. So cake is a great example of this. And it sort of goes back to my mom. Why will my mom sort of break down and eat a cake? It's because cake has an amazing mouth feel. It's delicious, full of chocolate, and you get that gratification now. And then your body doesn't really change all that much after you eat a piece of cake. It's the incremental cake you do or do not eat over the courses of weeks and months that makes you fit or makes you fat. And our brains just don't do a good job dealing with that. That feedback loop is broken. So you have to start reintroducing those feedback loops. So let me give an example. Everyone knows that it's bad for the environment to drive. Does that change their behavior? No, not really. But the Prius introduced this big screen display. You can sort of see it charted over time, and there's no real game there, but it does change the way people drive. You get a whole bunch of people making small changes, and then this small group of people becoming hypermilers. And in fact, BMW, in a study, tried to make this even more prominent. So they took that screen, made it even bigger, made it even more obvious when you're having great miles per gallon and less great miles per gallon. And the result is that they had to cancel the study halfway through. Why? Because the rates of accidents went up. And now they're like, okay, you just put a giant screen right in the middle of people. They're going to be watching that, not the road. So then they tried putting other things there. And the rates of accidents dropped again. It really was that people were making an amalgamation of lots of poor little decisions, where they would not hit the accelerator when they really should have, because they're like, I want that extra little boost. They would roll through stop signs, those yellow lights. They'd be like, I really don't want to lose all the kinetic energy. They roll through. So it's an amalgamation of all these tiny little things that put them in danger. Well, that's interesting, because that means people are willing to put themselves in mortal danger, to kill themselves for the sake of a feedback loop. For the sake of an integer they don't even care about, they're willing to die. So if that's true, then if we can give people that same side of insight, that immediate feedback about what they're doing, they are certainly willing to be healthy for the sake of a feedback loop, for the sake of great design. So let me give you a couple examples from the tech world about how we use feedback loops. So Amazon discovered that for every 100 milliseconds they could make their pages load faster, overall sales on their website went up by 1%. And at the scale of Amazon, that's huge. Now what's strange about that 100 millisecond number is that human reaction time is around 200, 250 milliseconds. So this is half of human reaction time. So you wouldn't think it would make a difference, but it does. Why? Because people are willing to see that thing that they're looking for that much faster, and you get this little bit of it. The delayed gratification cycle is smaller. Google found that for every half a second that they can reduce page load speed, their page views, their AdSense, all went up by 20%. Again, at the scale of Google, that's huge. And this is only twice human reaction time. You wouldn't think that 5 or 0.5 seconds would make a big difference, but it does. More examples. You look at World of Warcraft, or Farmville, or Foursquare, or Twitter, or email. All of these things, it turns out, end up being little feedback loops. With World of Warcraft, it's getting points. With Farmville, I don't really know. With Foursquare, you get your badges and your points as soon as you check in. With Twitter, you send something out and you immediately start getting stuff back in. It turns out that email, by the way, is one of the very best examples of what's known in cognitive psychology as a Skinner box. Skinner was this awesome researcher in the 1950s, and he discovered that random rewards are incredibly powerful. That if you give a pigeon a button and it presses that button, and randomly a food pellet comes out, that these pigeons start, one, they really like doing it, and two, they start forming these elaborate rain dances before pecking it because they're learning on noise. But what's interesting here is that this random reward turns out to have 2 to 3 times the dopamine release that a normal reward is, one that you're expecting. And email is exactly that way. Whenever you check your email, you never know whether you're going to get something new, and that sort of explains why you like sneak off when you're meeting an old friend to the bathroom and just so you can sort of check your BlackBerry. Like it's actually a physical addiction. So these are types of feedback loops. So let me give you a couple examples of ways people have used these feedback loops to change people's behavior in a real way. So let's take a look at speeding. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these sorts of things where it has the speed limit and then what you're actually going. And despite what some people think, these don't actually report up to Big Brother. They're just there visually. And it turns out they're amazingly effective. So this comes out of a study in Washington. This is over the course of 5 years. So this is long-term behavior change. Discovered adding these things made a 10% reduction in speed at this intersection for 46% of people. And this is 5 years after it was installed. So this is long-term, right? And so you can see for people that reduced it between 5 and 9, it was 36% and so on. So these things are effective. A group in Germany, or sorry, in Japan, was working on other mechanisms of giving people feedback about speeding. And here they said, well, let's just color coordinate the speedometer so that you can see when it's in the green section, you're doing it right. And this did change. It's like a 5% change in speed adherence. And then they did something else. And this gets back to Enrique's points about emotional design. They said, let's make this feel a little bit more emotional. And so they had instead the needle bent to be trying to get towards the right speed limit. And people hated it because they're like, it just looks wrong to be bent. And they always would change their speed until it looked exactly right. And this has like a 15, or I think it was between 15 and 20% adherence rate for just something as simple as making this needle curve. Because all of a sudden it became emotional. This feedback loop was much stronger. Similarly, out of University of Copenhagen, I think their IIT, they realized something really clever. So it turns out that people are pretty bad at pitch. Anyone that's gone to karaoke knows this. But they're really good with tempo. So if you snap your fingers to your favorite song, you will almost always get it within 4% of the original tempo of the song. Just the way that people works. So they thought, we can use this to get people to drive the right speed limit. We'll just, whatever song they're listening to, their favorite song, if they're over the speed limit, we'll make the song sound too fast, and if they're under the speed limit, we'll make the song sound too slow. And boy, did that work. People didn't even realize what was going on. They just very quickly started driving exactly the right speed limit because otherwise their favorite song sounded terrible. So another example. Let's take a look at recycling. Because this, I think, is one of the best examples of behavior change. And their interface is very clever because it used a very social proof mechanism of working. Originally, people thought that it was going to be a fad in the 1980s, and it wasn't. And here's the reason why, I think. I'll start with a little side story, which is there's a company, I think, called Osprey that works on power reduction, or power consumption reduction. And so they went out testing messages, and they hung up on people's doorknobs different messages. And some of the messages would be, if you reduce your power consumption, you're a good citizen. Other ones were, if you reduce power consumption, you'll save money. None of those worked. They had zero effect change. The final one they did was, if you reduce your power consumption, that's good because your neighbors already do it. And it turned out that message had a 6% reduction in people's power output. Something as simple as just the message, right? You often think of the interface as this thing or this product, but often it's just the very simple message that makes it happen. And the point they found was that social proof and knowing that other people around you are doing it is incredibly powerful. So the reason why I think recycling has been so successful is because of those blue containers. You see your neighbors doing it, and that makes you feel a little bit guilty if you aren't. And so the research backs that up. So that's another form of feedback loop, although this time it's a little bit more social. So let's return to the antibiotics and say, now that we know about this whole feedback thing, how could we redesign the antibiotics to work a little bit better? And I'll warn you, this is a little bit of a toy solution, but I think gets the point across. So these are a pair of hands. I found them on the internet. And to them, I added this little blotch. And so here's the idea, as a nice little feedback loop. Imagine you go to the doctor, they give you your antibiotics, and then they stamp your hand, and they say, only when you finish your antibiotics course will this thing disappear. You'd be pretty sure that almost everyone would finish the antibiotics course. And if you put this thing on their forehead, I think they'd probably take the entire bill at once. Right? But these are the kinds of things which elevate the visibility and hence makes a tighter feedback loop. So let me talk about it in reverse now. How do you break a feedback loop to change people's behavior? So I went to China a couple years ago and realized that something was interesting going on. I could sometimes access the BBC. It wasn't that there was a full block going on, but just a partial block. In fact, it made BBC just sometimes work, sometimes not work. Often it was just incredibly slow. And the result that I got is, even knowing that the BBC was blocked and I shouldn't be able to access it, I found myself not getting mad at the Great Chinese Firewall. I found myself getting mad at the BBC for being so frickin' slow. And that's smart. So we can use the same thing. I mean, do people here have trouble with procrastination? I'm assuming so. I mean, you're here instead of working, so clearly the answer is yes. So I do as well, and it's because you get those little dopamine hits. Every time you get a new piece of information, your brain says, ooh, awesome. That's why we all love infographics, because it makes the information easily parsable and gives you these bits of dopamine just like every time you get this new little stat. So you can reverse this. So I wrote this little thing as an internal test, and all it does is that it says every time you go to a site you don't want to go to, say Facebook, at the morning, it works just fine. But every subsequent time you go, it randomly slows that connection down. So say I go to Reddit, and all of a sudden Reddit's just crawling, and it's never quite enough time that I want to go turn the whole thing off, because if I just wait another 3 or 4 seconds, the page will show up. And what this means is that very quickly, between me and the people that I was testing this on, they just got really annoyed with things like Facebook. They just didn't care. They'd go to Facebook, it would start loading really slow, and they're just like, whatever, I guess it's more fun for me to go do my real work. So this is a breaking of the feedback loop, right? You're taking that instant gratification and you're making it a delayed gratification, and that changes people's behavior. It actually changes so much that I rarely check those sites anymore, because I get this intrinsic bad feeling towards it. So, moving into the final parts of the talk, another form of feedback loop that we know about is that if you just write down your meals, you'll lose weight. There's a big study, I think, in JAMA, 10,000 people, and they discovered that simply the act of writing down what you eat, not its macronutrients, just what you ate for every meal, will double the weight loss for whatever diet plan you happen to be on, because it makes you conscientious. And so for the Massive Health's very first experiment, we wanted to play around with this. But should point one thing out as you design, and that is, no matter how good you are, there is no substitute for trying it. You will be wrong, so figure out ways of prototyping. So a quick example of prototyping. This, as you might assume, is a block of wood. But that's just a lack of imagination. This is also a Wii controller. Nintendo, before they came out with their super successful Wii controller, did a lot of prototyping with blocks of wood and just sort of waving around and imagining what games would look like. But that's not all this block of wood is. This block of wood was also the Palm Pilot. The founder, Jeff, of Palm Pilot walked around with a block of wood sitting on his belt for weeks. And he would bring it out and pretend to scribble on it just to figure out how it would be to actually have this thing. How would it actually be used? And so something as complicated as the Palm Pilot can now be prototyped as a 50-cent block of wood. That's powerful because it means that we can start getting to products for people and for making products that people love much, much, much faster. So at Massive, our first experiment was something called the Eatery, which is all about just taking pictures of food. I'll show you a very, very short demo in a second. And really for us, this was a prototype. It took us a little over a month or so to make. And we just wanted to start testing out our hypotheses. So it's very simple. All you do is you snap a picture of your food. You maybe give it a title. You don't need to, and then you just rate it fit or fat. The idea is make you conscientious about what you're eating. And what's sort of interesting here is that because we went for such strong feedback loops, and other people will then rate your meal as well, and so you get this quick feedback. Within the first 2 weeks, we had over 25 or 2.5 million ratings of food. And I actually forgot to look up the numbers now, but it's much, much, much bigger since it's been out a while now. And given that sort of tight feedback loop, we were starting to, within 24 hours, come up with these interesting eating maps of San Francisco, for instance. So you can see that people in breakfast generally eat great. Lunch is by far the worst because everyone's snacking right outside their office. And then at dinner, everyone was starting to go home, and you can see that it's not quite as unhealthy. Right? So this is 24 hours worth of data only because we had this really tight feedback loop. And in fact, we were then able to, with 48 hours worth of data, create a map of the world to show how people eat over time. So some things to watch out for are that it'll start in Europe, it'll move across the US, you'll see various countries light up in red, the UK, and it's actually pretty neat to see the breakfast starting healthy, lunches get unhealthy. and dinners become slightly less so. And so this is the kind of data that's never been available to people before, because it's telling you how people actually eat in the real world, and how healthy they think it is versus how healthy other people think it is. So that's the power of the feedback loop, because all we did, it's a very, very simple product. You just take a picture of your food, rate it, and have other people rate it. Not much science going on there, although there's a fair amount behind the scenes to figure out what those ratings mean. But that's a feedback loop, and people love it. Turns out for every one picture that people snap, they've been rating on average 20 other meals. People feel this emotional connection because it's so fast. So the conclusion is that, oh, I forgot one really important thing about the music. Music is also not just powerful in terms of keeping people from driving too fast. It turns out that how much or how fast the music you're listening to is determines how much food or drink you'll have. So there are these sets of studies in pubs in Britain, and it turns out that by switching from a slower music to a faster music, people consume 34% more food and alcohol because you start chewing faster. So these things are really powerful. So now you know, if you ever start a cafe, what kind of music to play. But anyway, so these are the kinds of feedback loops that we need to start getting involved in design. It's not enough to just show people data, you have to get them involved. And if people are willing to die for feedback loops, they're certainly willing to become healthy for a feedback loop. And if we don't do that, we're going to end up living in a world where 80%, like only 2 out of 10 people are considered fit. So that's the kind of stuff we work on Massive Health, and I hope that this has been useful.